Dreadful, clueless, and consistently failing. Even worse than Peke, Yellow Star, and maybe even Dyrus. This player is considered by many, I'd even say considered by most, to be the worst League of Legends pro of all time. From missed skill shots to being caught out in the jungle over and over again. His mistakes were so frequent that they became predictable, and of course, contributing to some of the most ridiculous moments in pro play history. This is the story of the one, the only, the legendary Forgiven. Dominant, decisive, and undeniably talented, even more skilled than some of the most hyped players of his time. Forgiven wasn't just good, he was considered by many, maybe even most, to be the best AD carry of his generation. His rise was meteoric, and his early performances were nothing short of breathtaking. From his impeccable mechanics to his aggressive lane dominance, he was a player that struck fear into the hearts of his opponents. Forgiven wasn't just aiming to win, he was aiming to completely obliterate anyone who stood in his way. But before we get too deep into his professional downfall, let's talk about how he got there. Born in Greece, Forgiven grew up in a region not traditionally known for producing top-tier esports talent, but that didn't stop him. His relentless drive and exceptional skill in solo queue quickly caught the attention of the professional scene. By the time he entered the European LCS, it was clear that he wasn't just another rising star. He was the rising star. Forgiven's journey began with SK Gaming, where he immediately stood out. His raw mechanics and ability to carry games single-handedly earned him the respect of analysts and fans alike. It was during this time that his reputation as a cold, calculated AD carry was cemented. He wasn't just there to win, he was there to dominate. But, as we'll soon see, his rise to the top wasn't as smooth as it appeared. While his in-game prowess was unmatched, the seeds of conflict and frustration were already beginning to take root, setting the stage for what would become one of the most notorious falls from grace in League of Legends history. Despite Forgiven's meteoric rise and dominant performances, the first signs of trouble began to emerge sooner than anyone expected. His mechanics were undeniable, but behind the crisp play and aggressive attitude, cracks were starting to show. While he consistently outperformed his lane opponents, it became clear that his playstyle often clashed with that of his teammates. Forgiven was the kind of player who demanded everything revolve around him: the team's resources, the draft, the strategy. If he wasn't the focal point, problems would follow. Early on, his hyper-focused style worked. Teams built strategies around him, and it paid off in the form of wins. But League of Legends is a team game, and Forgiven's constant need for attention began to cause internal friction. His insistence on playing the game his way led to arguments behind the scenes. Coaches and teammates who wanted to run more diverse strategies found themselves frustrated, forced into one-dimensional game plans that left little room for flexibility. Even more troubling was his inability, or outright refusal, to adapt to the changing meta. While other players embraced new champions and adjusted their playstyles to match the shifting game, Forgiven stubbornly stuck to what he knew: hyper carries. If the meta favored utility AD carries or required more teamwork-oriented picks, Forgiven would push back, often locking in champions like Draven or Lucian, regardless of the team's needs. It wasn't just his champion pool that was limiting his teams, it was his attitude. Forgiven's frustration with teammates not playing up to his standards was becoming more apparent. He was known to publicly call out fellow players, airing internal disputes in post-game interviews and on social media. While many players have bad games, Forgiven's struggles were tied to his ego and his inability to compromise. The once promising star had begun his descent, and what followed would only amplify the damage. As the cracks in Forgiven's career widened, the moments that defined his downfall became painfully clear. His worst moments weren't just embarrassing, they became infamous in the League of Legends community, moments that players and fans still talk about today. The first major incident came during a high-stakes match in the EU LCS. His team was on the brink of a crucial victory, but instead of sealing the deal, Forgiven's ego got the better of him. In an aggressive overextension, He dove deep into enemy territory without proper vision or team support. The result? An instant deletion, throwing away his team's chance to win and swinging the game in the opponent's favor. Fans couldn't believe it. How could one of the world's best AD carries make such a rookie mistake? But that was just the beginning. In another match, Forgiven's refusal to adapt was on full display. The meta had shifted toward utility-based champions, but Forgiven, known for his hyper carries, refused to budge. During a pivotal playoff series, his team urged him to pick a safer, more team-oriented champion, but Forgiven stubbornly locked in Draven, a pick that was completely out of place. What followed was a disaster. He was heavily countered, unable to make an impact, and his team crumbled. Fans were outraged, blaming him for the loss and questioning why he would prioritize his ego over the team's success. Perhaps the most damaging moment came during a live broadcast when Forgiven openly berated his teammates for a poor performance. Mid-game, his frustration boiled over, leading to a toxic rant that aired in front of thousands of viewers. The outburst didn't just damage his reputation, it deeply fractured his team's morale. Coaches and players struggled to recover from the incident, and the community quickly turned against him. What had once been competitive fire now looked like arrogance and lack of discipline. The lowest point of his career, though, came during his team's appearance at the 2016 World Championship. With everything on the line, Forgiven failed to rise to the occasion. His performance was riddled with mistakes, missed positioning, failed engagements, and an overall lack of impact. Facing Samsung Galaxy, he was thoroughly outclassed, his mistakes magnified on the global stage. His team was swiftly eliminated, and Forgiven's dream of proving himself on the world stage was shattered. These moments solidified Forgiven's legacy, not as the dominant force he once was, but as a player who crumbled under pressure, refused to adapt, and let his ego tarnish his career. Forgiven's downward spiral didn't just affect his own career. It had a profound impact on every team he was part of. In the world of professional League of Legends, team cohesion is everything, and Forgiven's presence often became a source of tension. His demanding nature and refusal to adapt led to a strained atmosphere in any team he joined. Teammates were forced to play around his one-dimensional style, often leading to rigid drafts and predictable strategies that opposing teams easily exploited. One of the clearest examples of this came during his time with H2K. While the team had the potential to be a top contender, Forgiven's inability to compromise on champion picks or adjust to his team's needs made them vulnerable. The pressure on his teammates to compensate for his aggressive playstyle often led to mistakes and disjointed team fights. What could have been a balanced and flexible team turned into a one-man show, with everything revolving around Forgiven, whether they wanted it to or not. Coaches found themselves in an impossible position, stuck between trying to manage Forgiven's ego and fostering a positive team environment. Some tried to rein him in, but his reputation for resisting authority only worsened the situation. Others gave in to his demands, allowing him to call the shots, but that too led to poor results. The result was a cycle of frustration that affected the entire team's performance. Off the rift, the impact was just as damaging. Forgiven's public outbursts and refusal to accept responsibility for losses alienated not only his teammates, but also the broader fan base. The support that teams rely on from fans began to wane as frustration with his attitude grew. While his skill was undeniable, the emotional toll he took on the teams he played for left a trail of broken dynamics, wasted potential, and a lot of what-ifs. As Forgiven's career progressed, his continued failures became impossible to ignore. What had once been a promising legacy of mechanical dominance was overshadowed by a string of poor performances, bad decisions, and his infamous attitude. Game after game, his inability to adapt to new metas and his stubborn insistence on playing the game his way dragged his teams down. Instead of improving, his play became predictable and his decision-making faltered in crucial moments. The worst part? He never seemed to acknowledge his role in these failures. The League of Legends community, once full of admiration for his early brilliance, turned against him. Fans who had once cheered for his aggressive playstyle grew tired of his refusal to evolve and his constant complaints about teammates. Social media buzzed with criticism, as fans voiced their frustrations with his attitude and poor performances. Forgiven's legacy shifted from being a mechanically gifted player to someone who, despite his undeniable talent, was too set in his ways to ever reach his full potential. Reddit threads and memes poked fun at his stubbornness, turning his once feared name into a punchline. The community was divided. Some die-hard fans still believed in his raw skill and hoped for a comeback, while others had given up on him entirely, labeling him a relic of an older era who couldn't keep up with the evolving game. His attempts to return to the professional scene, including brief stints on various teams, only reinforced his reputation as a player who was past his prime. Each comeback seemed to follow the same pattern: initial hype, followed by disappointment and inevitable underperformance. As younger, more adaptable players took over the spotlight, Forgiven's relevance in the scene diminished. His once brilliant career had become a cautionary tale of what happens when a player refuses to grow alongside the game. For most fans, his legacy had shifted from being one of the best AD carries of his time to being one of the most disappointing careers in LoL history. Forgiven's career serves as a stark reminder that raw talent alone is never enough in professional League of Legends. His early dominance and mechanical brilliance should have secured him a place among the all-time greats, but his stubborn refusal to adapt and his toxic attitude ultimately defined his downfall. Instead of evolving with the game, he clung to outdated strategies, alienating teammates and fans alike. What could have been a legacy of greatness is now remembered as a story of missed opportunities and wasted potential. In the end, Forgiven will be remembered not for his early successes, but for how his ego and unwillingness to change led to one of the most infamous downfalls in LoL history. If you're passionate about the stories behind League of Legends and want to dive deeper into the moments that shaped the game's history, then leave your most iconic moment in the comments. Don't miss out on more in-depth documentaries that capture the essence of what makes League of Legends and its players truly legendary. Subscribe now and be part of the journey.